All right, so I am now recording. Well, welcome everybody to the Biology 65 Human Anatomy Mid-Semester Workshop, the second mid-semester workshop. Armand Alei, he's one of our other tutors for the College of Health and Human Sciences Student Success Center, presented a workshop a little while back. And today, I, Stacey DeMertzis, one of the other tutors for the college, will be presenting the second workshop. All right. So in today's workshop, we are going to review some key concepts pertaining to what you guys have been covering pretty recently in lecture. This workshop, the goals of this workshop are to help you prepare for the upcoming lecture exam and then, of course, the final exam, which is coming up. There will also be a final exam review workshop that Armand and I will present in early December, and we will send out the information for that as well. So in today's workshop, we're going to go over 3 systems that you guys have learned about recently in lecture. We'll start talking about the respiratory system. We'll talk a little bit about the cardiovascular system, and then we'll end with the digestive system. And so for today's workshop, I really want to make it as interactive as possible and kind of serve as like a study session in a way. So please feel free to unmute yourself or put comments or questions in the chat. You can chat to the whole group, and then, or if you feel more comfortable, you can private message me. Let me see. And then I just asked that everybody, if you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself so that we can minimize the background noise as well. Alrighty. So let's get started. So let's start talking about the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is a concept that you guys have covered in lecture. And what's important to note about the respiratory system is that it is divided into kind of 2 sections. We're studying the anatomy of it. We have the upper respiratory tract, or the like the upper portion of the respiratory system, and then what's called the lower respiratory tract, or like the lower portions. And so what's important to note is that the different components of the respiratory system, the different organs that make up the system, we can actually kind of separate them or categorize them based on if they're part of the upper respiratory tract or the lower respiratory tract. So I want us all to do this little activity where in this image and then also on this list, I have listed the components of the respiratory system, and I've identified which ones are considered part of the upper respiratory tract and then which ones are considered part of the lower respiratory tract. But this slide is out of order. When we think about the order of the respiratory system and where things are aligned, right? A clue is think about the pathway of air, right? Let's think about the function of the respiratory system. It's to inhale air, expire carbon dioxide, right? Inhale oxygen, expire carbon dioxide. So this pathway of air from the atmosphere into our respiratory system, into our lungs, is going to hit all of these organs that line up our respiratory system. But there's we have to be able to identify the correct pathway. So what I want you all to do is I want you to rearrange these in the correct order. We'll start with the upper respiratory tract. So you can put in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and kind of share your thought process of and you can simply put like the letters, like let's say, for example, you think C or D comes first, like you can list that first and so on and so forth. Let's do the upper respiratory tract first. So what is the correct order? So I'll give you guys a few minutes to do this. Feel free to unmute, put it in the chat, talk amongst yourselves, and then we will go over the answers together and kind of talk about essentially the pathway of air through the respiratory system. Give you guys a few minutes. Feel free to unmute, put it in the chat. You can chat publicly, or you can direct message me if you would like. Give you guys an extra minute, and then we will go over. All right, so I'm getting some answers in the chat. Let's see, I'm going to annotate. Yeah. Okay, so some answers I'm getting in the chat are that if we think about the pathway of air from the atmosphere into our lungs, into the respiratory system, which order of the organs, kind of like what is the arrangement? And I have this image here on the left to kind of guide you. It's not thoroughly labeled. And so that way we can kind of use this as like a little quiz to see if we remember the identification of the organs. So some things I'm seeing in the chat are that the very first thing that, or like the start of the pathway is going to be D, and I'll put a 1 right here. So the nose and the nasal cavity. And then a second thing would be the paranasal sinuses. And then I'm also seeing in the chat that after air flows through the nasal cavity and the paranasal sinuses, it's going to hit the pharynx. And then after the pharynx, it will hit the larynx. And so a quick note about the pharynx, I put the 3 portions because the pharynx is divided into 3 portions, and they have very specific names that are related to kind of where they're located within the respiratory system. And we'll go over that when we go over the answer. So that was for the upper. So let's do the lower one, the lower respiratory tract. Let's put these in order. Feel free to unmute or put your ideas in the chat. I'll annotate on the screen to follow along. And then the next slide will reveal the correct order, and then we'll go over that. Oops. Sorry. Let me reshare my screen. Sorry about that. Can you all see my screen again, full screen?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you guys. All right, let me pull up the chat. I see a question in the chat. Sorry, I didn't catch the order of the upper tract. Oh, we will go over that on the next slide. And we'll go over both the upper respiratory tract order and then the lower respiratory tract. So what we're doing now, I'm so sorry, my screen, I had to unshare for a minute to fix something. So here is the incorrect order. And so similar to what we did for the upper respiratory tract, let's take the components of the lower and let's put them in the correct order. You can type out the whole names if you'd like to, or I put letters here so that it can be faster for you all to identify. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to do that. Feel free to talk and chat amongst yourselves, ask questions, and we'll review the answer together on the next slide. And you can take this opportunity as like a way to quiz yourself if you don't want to look at your notes, or if you have like your lecture notes with you, feel free to use those as well. Whatever you're comfortable with, or whatever you feel will help you and make the most out of today's workshop. Everything is welcome. All right, so I'll give you guys about 1 more minute, and we will go over the answers on the next slide. All righty. Thank you for those participating in the chat. So let's move on to the next slide. Let's go over the correct order of the entire respiratory tract, both the upper and the lower divisions. So here's the correct order. So in the upper respiratory tract, right, let's think about this conceptually in terms of the pathway of air. So when air travels from the atmosphere into our bodies, through our respiratory system, into our lungs, what is the order of the organs that air is going to come in contact with? So first, we have here that air is going to travel through our nose and our nasal cavity. And then within the our head or skull, we have what are called paranasal sinuses. And basically what these are kind of little empty spaces or air sacs within the skull bones that just allow for like making the skull a little lighter. And so it kind of helps with that like airflow. So after the air travels through the nose, paranasal sinuses, it is going to reach the pharynx. And the pharynx has 3 specific portions. The pharynx is divided into what is called the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngeal pharynx. And then after the pharynx, air is going to pass through the larynx. And so a lot of students, and myself included, when I took the course, I tended to have a hard time to remember the correct order of the portions of the pharynx. But let's look at this in terms of its name, right? So we start with the nasopharynx as the first of the 3 portions of the pharynx. And this makes sense because if we think about it conceptually, that air is going to pass through the nose and the nasal cavity first, the nasopharynx would be the first portion of the pharynx. And then the oropharynx, which is situated near the oral cavity. And then we have the laryngeal pharynx. And so what makes sense why the laryngeal pharynx, or what can help us remember that the laryngeal pharynx is the last portion of the pharynx, is that directly after the laryngeal pharynx, we reach the larynx, and we see that kind of name match. So that's a little tip I have when it comes to learning anatomy, especially certain vocabulary words, is really look at the prefix, the suffix, look at how it's spelled, and that can give you some clues. So from our nose to our larynx, and in this image right here, I kind of have it sectioned off, right? We would consider this the upper respiratory tract. Now let's talk a little bit about the lower respiratory tract. So after the larynx, which is part of the upper tract, air is going to pass through the trachea. The trachea is also called the windpipe, and it is drawn here, this yellow structure right here is the trachea. Air is going to pass through the trachea. It's going to travel through the bronchi, and the bronchi, kind of like the pharynx, has 3 main portions. The first portion we call the main bronchi, and these bronchi branch out into several smaller segments, right? I'm sure in lecture you guys have kind of refer to this as a bronchial tree, right? When we think of trees and tree branches, right? It's getting from the trunk to the branches. It starts off large and it branches smaller and smaller and smaller out. And we'll see kind of how that looks like. So the three portions of the bronchi, we start with the main portion, and then that breaks off into the lobar bronchi, and those branch off further to form what's called segmental bronchi. When I was learning anatomy and I took the course, we refer to them as primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, and tertiary bronchi. But I believe in your lecture course, they're referred to as main, lobar, and segmental. So as bronchi continue to branch out, they branch out into smaller and smaller branches of the bronchi, and then we call these bronchioles. And so bronchioles are significantly smaller than bronchi, and there are two portions, particularly the very end portions of the bronchioles, that are important to note. And the names of these are the terminal bronchioles and then the respiratory bronchioles. And we'll see later the difference between the two, especially physiologically. So after the air passes through the bronchi, the bronchioles, specifically the terminal, and then the respiratory, the air that's traveled through the respiratory bronchioles is then going to reach what's called an alveolar duct. And it's this connection between the bronchioles, and then we'll see later, I have an image of lung tissue and what's really going on deep within our lungs to carry out the functions of the respiratory system. Alveolar ducts are connected to what we call alveolar sacs, and basically those are groups that hold individual alveoli. And we will dive deep into what alveoli are and what they do and what they look like in a moment. All right, so that's kind of an overview of the organs, the structures that make up the respiratory system. So we reviewed like the pathway of air. We were able to correctly identify the structures and the correct order in which air is going to pass. So that's kind of like an overview of the anatomy specifically. But let's look a little bit about how the anatomy has very specific functions. Let's look a little bit about the physiology. So similar to how anatomically we break up the respiratory system into the upper tract and the lower tract, when we think about not just the anatomy, but the functions, we can also kind of identify two main kind of ways that the respiratory system is going to work. So we have the conducting portion and we have the respiratory portion. And so right here, so conducting portion, I have it labeled as number 1, and then the respiratory portion, I have it labeled as number 2. And then on the right here, A and B, these are two functions. So the respiratory system is responsible for air transport and gas exchange. I want you guys to identify for me. Feel free to unmute or put your answer in the chat. Which portion is responsible for what? So you can match like 1 to A, or if you think it's B, 1 and B, 2 and A, 2 and B. What do you think the correct portion, what do you think is the correct relationship between the portion and the action, the function? So match the, and we're just focusing on the first two right now. The bottom where it says upper respiratory tract, we'll get to that in a moment. But for right now, let's label the portion with its function. Give you guys about a minute and we will go over the answer. So throughout this whole workshop, every time we do kind of little practice problems like this and activities, we will absolutely be going over the answers in the next slide. And we'll talk about the details behind it, and you guys have opportunities to ask questions and kind of share our thought process on how we get to our answers. Give you guys about a minute and then we will discuss. And a reminder for the chat, you are more than welcome to chat to the whole group, or if you prefer to direct message me, you're more than welcome to do that as well. And of course, if you would like to unmute and verbally share your answer, that is more than welcome as well. Okay. Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat. All right, so I'm seeing in the chat that a lot of comments in the chat are saying that the conducting portion is responsible for air transport, and the respiratory portion is responsible for gas exchange. And on the next slide, it'll reveal the answer, and we'll talk about that. So thank you for answering the first portion of this. Let's answer the second portion of this, and then the next slide will have the answers to both of these. So let's think back about the difference between the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. In the previous slides, we thought about it in terms of which structures are considered part of which tract, right? Like, for example, we talked about how the trachea is part of the lower respiratory tract, or how the pharynx is part of the upper respiratory tract. I want you to try to identify with knowing which structures are part of which section, right? Upper versus lower. Which function do you think it is responsible for? So do you think the upper respiratory tract is a conducting portion? Do you think it's a respiratory portion? What about the lower? Do you think it's conducting, respiratory? So similar to what we did above, I want you to match the number to the letter. And I will give you a hint that one of these, either 1 or 2, has both. It is both a conducting and respiratory portion. But I won't tell you which one yet. That's your hint. So similar to what we just did, match the number to the letter. I'll annotate based on what I see in the chat, and of course, feel free to unmute. And then the next slide, we will go over the answer and talk about it. So I'll give you guys about a minute or two to do this, and then we will discuss. All right, I'm seeing some comments in the chat that the upper respiratory tract is also a conducting portion. And we've identified up here that the conducting portion is air transport, right? And then I'm also seeing in the chat that the lower respiratory tract is considered a respiratory portion, but it's also considered a conducting portion. So there's some of the answers I'm getting in the chat. So conceptually, let's think about this. So the upper respiratory tract, we can then say is responsible for air transport, right? Because it is a conducting portion. And then the lower respiratory tract, we can say is responsible for both air transport and gas exchange, because it is considered both a conducting portion and a respiratory portion. And we've clearly identified what that means. So thank you all for your participation in the chat. And let's go to the next slide and review the answer. And you guys were absolutely correct. So the conducting portion is responsible for air transport. So simply the movement of air from the atmosphere to inside our bodies, to our lungs. That is air transport. The respiratory portion, right, is responsible for gas exchange. And so gas exchange is a little bit more complex, and we start to think about the specific gases involved, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and its relationship to not only our respiratory system in our lungs, but actually our cardiovascular system in our blood. And we will touch on that more when we talk about the cardiovascular system. So awesome job in the chat, correctly identifying the portion to its general function. So when we think about it anatomically, again, great job, you guys answered correctly in the chat that the upper respiratory tract, right? We talked about the certain structures, right? Like the nose, the pharynx, the larynx. That is a conducting portion, meaning there's not really any gas exchange occurring. It's simply air transport. The lower respiratory tract, the reason why it is both a conducting and a respiratory portion, let's think about that, right? So with the lower respiratory tract, components like the trachea, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveolar, right? Air transport is still happening, right? Air still needs to get there. So that's why it's also considered a conducting portion, because air is still flowing, air is still being transported. But the reason why it is also considered a respiratory portion is, as we've identified, respiration, right? Gas exchange. Once we enter the lower respiratory tract and we get deeper and deeper and we start getting into the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts and the alveolar sacs and then the individual alveoli, that's where gas exchange is going to occur. And we're actually going to take a closer look at that when we look at an image of lung tissue. Any questions on this before we move on? All right. Okay. And just to remind, unless you have a question or making a comment, if everyone can unmute just so we can minimize the background noise. Thank you. All right, so as I said a few seconds ago, we're going to take a closer look at what is going on deep inside our lungs, right? How is gas exchange and the respiratory functions and respiratory portions of our respiratory system, how is that, like, let's identify anatomically first, and then we'll think about its function, right? So in the image to the left, I'm sorry, one second. Sorry, I had to fix something. So in the image to the left, I have a picture of what's called lung histology. And basically what this means is that if you were to take a portion of a lung and examine it under a microscope, this is what you would see. So what I want you all to do, similar to what we have been doing, is I would like you to anatomically identify the structures seen in this image. So just as we've been doing, match the number to the letter. And I'll give you guys a few minutes to do that. And then on the next slide, we will reveal the answer and talk about it. All right, I'm getting some comments in the chat. Thank you all. give you guys a few more minutes, and then we will review the answer together. All right, see more answers in the chat. Keep it coming. Thank you, guys. And then we will go over the answers shortly. Okay, and as you guys continue to put answers in the chat, I'm going to annotate what I see in the chat. So some comments in the chat are saying that number 1, the structure that's labeled number 1, is representing the respiratory bronchiole. I'm also seeing that number 3 is representing the alveolar sacs. Let's see. All right, I am also seeing that one is A, 3 is C. I'm also seeing the 3, oh, why can't I annotate? Oh, sorry, I went to the next slide and revealed the answer. It's okay, we're gonna talk about it anyway. Let me go ahead and clear the annotations. All right, perfect. So let's just go ahead and talk about the answers. So number 1, right, this structure right here, this is indeed the respiratory bronchiole. And so how do we know this, right? When we think back to the pathway of air and we talk about, it's going from the nose all the way down to our lungs, but it's got to go through, these different bronchi and bronchioles in different sections, right? We start off really big with the main bronchi. It's going to divide into the lobar and the segmental, and then the bronchioles. And then kind of when we think about it with its function, right? We think about conducting portion, right? The transport of air. And then we move on into the respiratory portion, particularly associated with the lower respiratory tract, in which we are then kind of recognizing this shift between not only are we transporting air, but gas exchange is going to start to occur. And so anatomically, our anatomical kind of landmark, right, is the respiratory bronchiole. It is the respiratory bronchiole comes after the terminal bronchiole. And as I said earlier, think about the name of it, right? If we're talking about the respiratory portion and we're talking about gas exchange, it would make sense that the respiratory bronchiole would be kind of like our landmark, the start of that. And that the terminal bronchiole, right? Terminal by definition means the end, that the terminal bronchiole would kind of represent the end of the like how do I want to phrase this? The end of the conducting portion only, right? There's no gas exchange from the terminal bronchial upward. But once we reach the respiratory bronchial, we're going to start getting into some gas exchange actions, right? So right here, the respiratory bronchial. And so then we move down to what is called the alveolar duct. And it's this kind of connection between the respiratory bronchial, and now we are entering into I like to call it the alveolar world, right? We have the duct, we have this kind of group of alveoli, and the alveoli here is number 4. These individual little pink circles here represent the alveoli. And so when alveoli are kind of grouped together, they oftentimes sit in this kind of cave or this sac. And so we call that the alveolar sac. So anatomically, this is the correct identification of what we would see or what we would label if we were examining a piece of lung tissue under a microscope. And that's what histology is, like it's the microscopic study. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the alveoli specifically. So the alveoli are they're made up of very thin walls of epithelium. And we've learned that epithelium, is a type of tissue, right? Epithelial tissue. It's very thin. And this is where gas exchange is occurring. This is where the main event is happening in the alveoli. We have gas exchange. So this is where oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to diffuse between the blood and the lungs. And we talked a little bit about, I gave kind of a little comment about how it's related to our cardiovascular system, our circulatory system, kind of what's going on within our bloodstream. And we will look more into detail with that as well. So I do see a question in the chat. If gas exchange happens only in the alveoli, are parts of the respiratory bronchi also considered the respiratory system? So yes, so gas exchange occurs kind of like, I think the best way to explain this is that like most of gas exchange, or like the majority of gas exchange, is going to occur in the alveoli. So alveoli is the specific place where gas exchange is occurring. And so when we think about like, okay, if the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts and the sacs, if those are also gas exchange, what's the connection, right? So alveoli are present throughout all of that, right? They're just, if you remember like the hierarchy of living things, right? We go cells, make up tissues, make up organs, make up systems, right? It's this like levels. The alveolar are the simplest level of gas exchange. So that's how I would remember it. Is like the deeper we're looking, the deeper we're diving into the lung, we're going to find the alveoli. And so the alveoli, there's a ton of them, and they're located throughout the portions which we would consider to be the respiratory portions, right? And that's why in this image here, we see a ton of alveoli starting from kind of where the respiratory bronchioles are branching out. And then we see them through the ducts, the sacs, and then the individual ones. I hope that answers your question. Okay, so if there's no more questions, I will move on. So the alveoli are housed within the sacs, ducts, and the bronchi. I wouldn't say the bronchi is definitely within the sacs. And then the duct is like the connection between the bronchiole and the where we would find alveoli. The bronchi are specific to actually the conducting portion. So alveoli are not really found in the bronchi. They're found right when we transition into the respiratory bronchioles. And so I feel like that's where I know when I was a student, I would get confused too, because bronchi and bronchioles, they sound so similar. So it's important to know the difference that bronchi are the bigger ones that we start off with, and they branch smaller and smaller and smaller until they become bronchioles. And I actually have a review question on that coming up soon. So we'll talk about that more. All right, so the alveoli, thin wall of epithelium, oxygen and carbon dioxide are diffusing between the blood and the lungs. And so this diffusion between the blood and the lungs, we refer to that as pulmonary circulation. And so by definition, pulmonary circulation is the conduction of blood to and from the gas exchange surfaces, right? Wherever we find alveoli. So my question for all of you is pulmonary circulation. Where else have we learned about that? What other body system do we talk about pulmonary circulation pretty significantly, other than the respiratory system, of course? What's something else that you guys have learned about in lecture where you talk about pulmonary circulation? See a comment in chat. The heart, yeah. The circulatory system, cardiovascular system, absolutely. And we're going to talk all about that pretty soon. All right. So let's move on to the next slide. So let's wrap up talking about the respiratory system by doing some review questions. And this is also an opportunity as we do these review questions that you can ask other questions if you have. Feel free to do that as well. So let's answer these 4 questions. So number 1, the bronchi branch into smaller tubes within, what we call the bronchial tree. We got the bronchi, and it's going to branch out, and they kind of look like little tree branches, which is why, it's also referred to as the bronchial tree. So when the size of these bronchi, or these tubes, as they branch out, when they become smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually become around 1 millimeter in diameter, there's a name change. They're no longer called bronchi. What do we call them? Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. Oh, I see a lot of comments in the chat. Bronchioles, yep. Yeah, so we're going from bronchi, right? We talked about how there's the main bronchi, branches to the lobar, branches to the segmental. Again, the way I learned it, I said primary, secondary, tertiary. I don't know if that's how they teach it in your lecture. I would double check on your lecture slides. But yeah, we go from the bronchi, we branch out, we get smaller and smaller and smaller until we hit the bronchioles. Absolutely. And the next slide will reveal the answers as well. So that for those of you that fill out the survey and get a PowerPoint, or excuse me, a PDF version of these slides, the answer key will be there so that you guys can quiz yourselves and whatnot. All right, so number 2, the pharynx. So we talked about this pretty early on when we were talking about the the difference anatomically between the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So the pharynx. What's interesting about the pharynx, and I have this image here that we've seen before. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but where it's pink, right? And I have this sentence that say pass. Oh, I think I'm actually going to reveal the answer if I read that statement. Never mind. But the pharynx right here in pink, it is located both within our nasal and our oral cavity. And we can kind of see this transition, right? Like up here, this would represent our nose. We got the bony concave within our nasal cavity, and then we're transitioning down. So the pharynx is in this interesting location where it's both in the nasal and oral cavity. So therefore, let's think about this kind of big picture. When we think about the pharynx, knowing that it's both part of the nasal and the oral cavity, it is an essential component of the respiratory system, of course, and we talked all about that, but also a different system. And we're actually going to talk about the system later on. What system do you think that is? Yep, I'm seeing some comments. Digestive system, absolutely. So When we think about the digestive system in terms of its anatomy and its functions, our oral cavity is very prevalent, very important in the digestive system. So the pharynx, being considered both nasal and oral, would make sense that we would talk about the pharynx and study it when we're studying not only the respiratory system, but also the digestive system. All right, number 3. Good job, everybody in the chat. So the larynx, right? The larynx is located after the pharynx. And we talked about that when we did that activity, when we were putting the components of the respiratory system in the correct order. We talked about that. So we have the pharynx, and then it goes into the larynx. After the larynx, it's going to divide into 2 other organs. Anteriorly, it's going to be one organ, and posteriorly, it's going to be a different. What are those 2 organs? What does the larynx divide into anteriorly and posteriorly? What are those 2 organs? And actually, no, I won't give you a hint. I'll have you answer it in the chat and then we'll talk about it. Think about the connection between, you know how number 2, we were talking about the connection between the respiratory system and the digestive system. Let's think about that for number 3. All right, see some comments in the chat that the trachea is the anterior component, you know, after the larynx. What the larynx is going to branch off into, like we're going from pharynx to larynx to, if we're focusing anteriorly, I see in the chat that we are going to be then studying and examining the trachea, and then posteriorly the esophagus. And that's absolutely correct. And your clue there was that like respiratory system versus digestive system. And so I think that gives away number 4. So the trachea is part of what system, while the esophagus is part of which system? Feel free to unmute or put in the chat. Yep, seeing a lot of comments in the chat that the trachea is part of the respiratory system, and then the esophagus is part of the digestive system. And when we think about that conceptually, right, if you're focusing on the respiratory system and you're like, all right, let me review, you know, the pathway of air. We got the nasal cavity, it's going to go down. Eventually, you're going to hit the trachea. So that's your clue, like, oh, okay, respiratory system. And then esophagus, we didn't talk about the esophagus in terms of, you know, respiration and the respiratory system. We're actually going to talk about that at the end of this workshop when we review the digestive system. All right, and so these are the answer keys. So indeed, bronchi branch out into bronchioles. The pharynx is part of the respiratory and digestive system. The larynx divides anteriorly, known as the trachea, and then posteriorly the esophagus, and then those specifically are related to respiratory and digestive systems. Awesome. So any questions before we move on to the cardiovascular system? All right, if there are no questions, I will move on. All right, so let's talk about the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system is a very interesting system because it is very complex. So the first thing that I want to ask you all and discuss is, let's think about this really, really high level for a moment, just a big overview, is that the kind of like the star of the show is what I like to call it, of the cardiovascular system, is the heart, right? This organ in the center of our chest that is responsible for pumping blood throughout our body. And so how does blood get to the heart? And then how does it leave the heart, right? The heart is part of the cardiovascular system, but also a lot of think of how I want to word this. When we talk about also the circulatory system and the cardiovascular system, we're not just talking about the heart, right? We're talking about all the vessels that are present throughout our entire body that is transporting this blood, right? It's transporting it to and from the heart, and that heart is pumping that blood. So there are two very important vessels within the cardiovascular system. We have veins and arteries. And I want you to tell me, think about the direction in which blood flows. I want you to tell me if veins carry blood, do they carry it to the heart, away from the heart? And what about arteries? A hint I will give you is that they're the opposite. So whatever veins do, arteries do the opposite. So I want you to tell me in the chat, or please feel free to unmute. In which direction does blood travel? And I have these images here. The left one represents veins and the right one represents arteries. It doesn't really tell us the direction, but this is more of just like an anatomy image if you guys wanted to review the vessels. All right, so I'm seeing in the chat that veins carry blood to the heart, while arteries carry blood from the heart. So let's check the next slide. And that is absolutely correct. So when we think about the, I guess we'll explain it on the next slide, but yes, great job, everybody. Veins carry blood to the heart, arteries carry blood away from the heart. And the way I like to remember it so I don't get mixed up is I like to say A away, like A arteries away, it's going away from the heart. That's what I like to say, just so that I don't mix it up. All right, awesome. So we talked about how the heart is the main component of the cardiovascular system, right? It's pumping the blood to our body. And then, our vessels are going to deliver blood to the heart and then also away from the heart. And we correctly identified which vessels do that. So I want us to do kind of this short activity of identifying or listing, what is the pathway of blood through the heart specifically? So not necessarily the whole body, right? Which is why if you see number 1 and number 15, and number 8, I have filled those out for you. So we know that veins are going to deliver blood to the heart. It's going to go through a very specific pathway within the heart. It's going to want to go to the lungs, and we'll talk about later why that is. And then eventually, it's going to continue its cycle or transport within the heart. And then eventually, go out. The blood is going to travel through arteries to our body. So I have this heart labeled here, numbers 2 through 14, excluding number 8, which is going to represent the lungs. I want you, so I don't have a word bank for this. So I want you to really try and kind of recall your heart anatomy. And so feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. I know this is kind of a longer activity, so I will give you a few minutes to do that. I also want to repost the links to the workshop survey and the YouTube channel. But in order to post those links, I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen for a second. Is it okay if I do that? Yes? Okay. Let me stop sharing just for 1 second so that I can. Okay, let me. Because I want you guys to get the links so that you guys can see the video recording of this after. And then also, so first link I'm putting is the YouTube channel. And then the second link is the survey, just giving us feedback on our workshop. And for those of you who fill out the survey, you will receive a PDF copy of my PowerPoint slides, and I will add, most of the slides have whenever we're doing an activity and there's an answer key, but if I feel like I want to just add some extra explanations, I will do that as well so that you guys have all the information. Okay, perfect. So let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay. Is it back to the slide that we were working on with numbers 1 through 15? Can someone let me know? Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Alrighty. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to work on this. Feel free to put your answers in the chat. You can also talk amongst yourselves, work together, and then we will go over the answers. Yeah, I'll give you guys about an extra minute. If you weren't able to finish, no worries at all. We're going to go over the answers on the next slide and we're going to talk about it. There's also for the, I believe it's slide 34 on your lecture slides. And I think it's the lecture that's titled Heart. I may be wrong, but I remember there's a slide 34 that has a great flow chart of this exact same concept. All right, so I'm seeing some comments in the chat. We will go over the answers next. Just give you guys a second to collect your answers. I'm seeing some comments rolling in. Sorry, this was a longer chat activity. But I'm seeing some great answers in the chat. And this is a concept that I know when I was a student and I took the course that it was very complex because there's so many steps. But once you get it down, it's like really cool to like appreciate how how the heart is designed to help keep us alive and its interactions with the lungs. So you guys have about an extra minute and then we will go over the answers on the next slide. Let's see. All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Don't worry at all. If you are not finished yet, we are going to review the order on the next slide. And then again, for those of you that fill out the survey, the PDF version will have this empty slide too, so you can use it as a way to quiz yourself. All right, so all right, here is essentially like the answer key to that slide, and it matches very well to the comments that I'm receiving in the chat. So let's review the pathway of blood through the heart. So we talked about how veins deliver blood to the heart. So if we imagine, if you can see my mouse, like a vein delivering blood to the heart. And that's why this arrow right here says from the body. I've labeled it systemic and I've highlighted it in blue. We will go over that in very shortly when we talk about the two different types of circulation. So don't worry about that too much right now. We will review that shortly. So for right now, veins delivering blood from the body to the heart. And then number 2, you see that it's listed twice. And I'm very pleased that a lot of you in the chat correctly identified that we have the superior vena cava up top and the inferior vena cava. So blood is going to travel from these vena cavas into number 3, the right atrium. It's then going to hit number 4, which is the tricuspid valve. It is also called the right atrioventricular valve. And this name makes sense because, we have the right atrium, we have the right ventricle. So this is, the right side of the heart. And a big note is that while it looks like it's the left side of the heart, when we're studying anatomy, and this is for any anatomical feature, right and left is often switched because it's as if we're looking at somebody else, right? So that's why it's switched. So we got the right atrium, the right ventricle. So this valve right here, it separates the atrium from the ventricle, hence the name, atrial ventricular valve. Why is it called a tricuspid valve? We can see here that there are 3 flaps. Tri means 3, hence the name tricuspid valve. All right, so we are now in the right ventricle. So the right ventricle is then going to pump blood through the pulmonary valve. And the pulmonary valve is not an atrioventricular valve, but it's a semilunar valve. And we will touch on what that means in a future slide. So the pulmonary valve. Blood is then going to travel through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries. And these pulmonary arteries are going to deliver the blood to the lungs, right? This is where number 8 comes in. We're going to the lungs. And so far, this makes sense, right? Number 1, we talked about veins delivering blood to the heart, right? And then we go through the vena cava, the atrium, the valve, the ventricle, and now, another valve, a pulmonary valve, and arteries, right? And remember what we said about arteries, away. The blood is going away from the heart. So it would make sense why the pulmonary arteries are carrying blood to the lungs, right? We're going away from the heart. We're going to the lungs. So blood is in the lungs. Blood is going to want to return, and we'll talk about, what goes on in the lungs. And we kind of talked about it a little bit already when we reviewed the respiratory system, right? We talked about inside the lungs, the alveoli and the gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide. But in terms of the heart, let's focus on the heart right now. So the pulmonary arteries within the lungs will then, branch and meet with pulmonary veins. And again, veins, by definition, they carry blood to the heart. So the pulmonary veins are going to carry blood from the lungs to the heart. And that's what we see number 9 here. That blood is then going to hit the left atrium, the bicuspid valve, otherwise known as the left atrioventricular valve, right? Separating the atrium from the ventricle. And it's bicuspid because there's only 2 flaps, unlike the tricuspid, which had 3, right? Bi means 2. It's then going to hit the left ventricle. Blood is going to travel through the aortic valve, which is also a semilunar valve, and we'll get into detail on that in a moment. The aortic valve then going to travel through the aorta, and the aorta is known as our body's largest artery, and it branches off into other arteries, right? Systemic arteries that, and what are these arteries going to do? Remember, away. They're going to deliver blood from the heart to our body, away from the heart. So that, in summary, is the pathway of blood, starting from systemic veins all the way to systemic arteries, right? So if we focus on this green arrow here that says from the body, and then this orange arrow here that says to the body, all of these steps in between is what helps get from this to that. So that is kind of like a high-level summary of pathway of blood through the heart. Any questions before we move on and kind of dive into systemic versus pulmonary and those types of like valves and circulations? Any questions on this before we move on? No? Okay, awesome. All right. So I want to quickly touch on the difference between systemic circulation and pulmonary circulation. So I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I really want to get to digestive system as well. So the way that we can summarize this is, let's look at this picture of the heart. Notice how portions of the heart are colored blue and other portions of the heart are colored red. So a tip that I have for all of you, when you're thinking about systemic versus pulmonary, specifically oxygenated versus deoxygenated, I want you to think of the two colors blue and red. Blue is going to represent deoxygenation or deoxygenated blood, while red is going to represent oxygenated blood. So when you're studying the heart, whether you're drawing it out yourself or you're looking at a textbook, if you have the opportunity to color it as you wish, I highly recommend paying close attention to, where in the heart and where in circulation is deoxygenated blood involved and where is oxygenated blood, and color it accordingly. And so we're going to see how this fits into identifying systemic circulation versus pulmonary circulation. And then also my second tip is always, always, always just remember, veins carry blood to the heart, regardless of what type of veins, whether they're systemic veins or pulmonary veins, the blood's going to the heart. And then arteries always, always, always carry blood away from the heart. So whether they are systemic or pulmonary, they are leaving the heart and they are going somewhere else. So that is just the kind of the two tips that I have to always remember when you're studying the cardiovascular system. So let's quickly look at systemic circulation. So with systemic circulation, we have essentially, I like to think of it as we're taking blood that's oxygenated and we're going through this pathway and eventually it's going to become deoxygenated. So when we think about it anatomically, right, let's start from the left ventricle. The left ventricle is going to, travel oxygenated blood to the aorta, then the systemic arteries, and we call them systemic arteries because they're pertaining to the arteries that are supplying our whole body. And then the arteries are then going to transition into systemic veins. And these veins are veins within our body that are going to then deliver deoxygenated blood to our atrium. And so why is there a transition of oxygenated blood to deoxygenated? The reason is because the arteries, the systemic arteries that are delivering oxygenated blood, they're giving that oxygen to the tissues. And so when they're giving that oxygen up, the blood is then going to run out of oxygen and become deoxygenated. And that's where the veins say, okay, time to go back to the heart so that we can then go to the lungs and get oxygenated. And so that's where we then see pulmonary circulation, right? We're starting with a deoxygenated state and our goal is to become oxygenated. So, right, we kind of end systemic circulation in the right atrium. So therefore, let's begin pulmonary circulation in the right ventricle, right? And that's why it's blue. I colored it blue to represent that it's deoxygenated. So we got deoxygenated blood. We're gonna go to the pulmonary arteries, right? And so arteries, they're carrying blood away from the heart into the lungs. And pulmonary arteries are blue because, well, they're deoxygenated and they need oxygen. So that's where they're going to the lungs. The lungs is going to then oxygenate the blood. And so then there's this transition between pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. And so how did we go from deoxygenated blood to oxygenated, right? The alveoli, the gas exchange that we talked about earlier. The pulmonary veins, right? Veins deliver blood to the heart. So now we got this oxygenated blood that's going to return to the heart, right? To the left atrium. And then, cool, we're back in systemic circulation, right? And we're back to, left atrium, left ventricle, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the pattern between the two. Any questions on that before we move on? Feel free to unmute and verbally ask a question, or you can put a question in the chat. I know this is a complex subject to get down. I know when I was a student and I first took the class, it was pretty complicated. But I always recommend labeling, coloring, especially with the cardiovascular system where it's like this theme of red versus blue, oxygenated versus deoxygenated. I think coloring really helps. Labeling, listing out the pathways, understanding the vocabulary, I feel like is a great base. And always remembering these 2 tips when in doubt that I have listed at the bottom. All right, so if there are no questions, we'll move on to the next slide. And so let's wrap up our discussion on the cardiovascular system. We have about 13 more minutes, which is great so that we can review quickly the digestive system before we wrap up. So some review questions for the cardiovascular system. So I got 3 review questions for you. This image that I have on the left, I like it because it kind of encompasses everything. It talks a little bit about systemic circulation, talks about the pathway of blood through the heart, gives a little bit of information on the valves that were used or that are located and functioning in the heart. So that's why I provided it here for you all to take a look at. So let's do 3 review questions before we talk about the digestive system. So number 1, as systemic arteries become systemic veins, we talked about this, right? What vessel is responsible for the gas exchange that changes the blood from oxygenated to deoxygenated? So let's think about that, right? We have systemic arteries. And what are systemic arteries? They branch off of the aorta. They're filled with oxygenated blood. They're going to carry that blood to our tissues so that our tissues can utilize the oxygen and become nourished. But, as we said, once the tissues use up the oxygen, the blood is going to run out of that oxygen, right? Because the tissues are going to take it. So the blood is going to become deoxygenated. But we can't just go from arteries to veins. There's got to be this connection, right? What vessel is that connection between arteries and veins? Or, vice versa, veins and arteries as well. So is it capillaries, venules, or arterioles? And this is kind of one of those answers that it's like, which one's the most correct? Because technically, well, let's think about gas exchange, actually, my bad. Gas exchange, that's what the question's asking. All right, so I see some comments in the chat, capillaries, okay. And then I have a question to review venules. Yeah, I can review venules real quick. So basically, it's kind of hard to draw out, so I'll verbally kind of share it. So when you have a vein and you have an artery, the connection between the two is the capillary. And that's why when you look at images, capillaries are oftentimes colored purple, right? Because blue and red together make purple. Venules and arterioles are the 2 vessels that connect like the capillaries to the veins and the arteries. So the order of that is going to be veins to venules to capillaries to arterioles to arteries. So it's like that extra, how we're talking about like bronchi become bronchioles because they branch out and get smaller and smaller. It's kind of the same here, right? You've got this big artery. It's going to branch off into arterioles, then the capillaries, then the venules, then the vein. So it's like that flow. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So that's number 1, capillaries. Let's answer number 2. So the cardiac cycle. We didn't really touch on the cardiac cycle in this presentation, but it's something that you guys learned in lecture. And so basically the cardiac cycle is the start of one heartbeat to the next, right? The heart pumps and produces a heartbeat. So when the ventricles, right, these 2 bottom chambers of the heart, when they contract, there's a certain name for there's a certain component or part of the cardiac cycle and it has a certain name. And then when the ventricles relax, that has like a vocabulary word as well. I'll give you a hint. The first one starts with an S and the second one starts with a D. Feel free to unmute or put your answer in the chat. right, see some comments in the chat. So this one's kind of a tough one. It's kind of like a challenge question. So we will, let's see how I want to explain this. All right, so I see some comments in the chat, systole and diastole. Absolutely. And if we look at number 3, it's kind of, this number 2 is kind of related to number 3 as well. So when the ventricles contract, this portion of the cardiac cycle indeed is called systole. And then when the ventricles relax, this is called diastole. So that's the cardiac cycle. Yeah, so those are the answers to those. Thank you for the comments in the chat. And then number 3, the heart sound, right? When we study heart sounds, we often say like lub and dub. Those are the 2 heart sounds. And those specific sounds are actually the closure of certain valves within our heart, right? And so I know earlier I promised that we'd talk about valves. So this is what I wanted to talk about specifically. So when you hear, if you were to listen to someone's heart with a stethoscope and you hear lub dub, you're hearing certain valves closing, right? So think about lub, right? And I'll answer the second half of this question to help you guys out. So lub is associated with systole, right? Which valves are closing when we hear that first sound, that lub? Which specific valves? Is it the atrioventricular valves or the semilunar valves? I see a comment in the chat, the atrioventricular valve. Let's go to the next slide. The answer is absolutely. So thank you all for doing the review questions for the cardiovascular system. I have the answers here and they will be provided in the PDF as well. So we have about 5-6 minutes. I'll stay on a few extra minutes for those of you that have questions. And so the last thing I want to talk about is the digestive system, and we'll do a brief overview because I want to respect everybody's time. So the digestive system. So anatomically, the digestive system is divided into 2 main categories: the alimentary canal and the accessory organs. And in this image here on the left, I want you to tell me, what do I have pictured here? Is this image representing the alimentary canal, or is it representing the accessory organs? So you're gonna have to think, you know, what organs make up the alimentary canal? What organs are considered accessory organs? And so in this image that I have on the left, what is being represented here? Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. I'll give you a hint. So in this question I have at the bottom, I said, which is also known as the GI tract. So I'll tell you that the alimentary canal is also known as the GI tract. So with knowing that, what is this picture representing? Is it the accessory organs or is it the GI tract, otherwise known as the alimentary canal? So I see some comments in the chat, the alimentary canal. So let's see. Absolutely. So disclaimer, this is most of the alimentary canal. What is missing here is the details in the mouth, such as the salivary glands that I did not know how to draw. So this is most of the alimentary canal, starting from the esophagus downward. So just keep in mind that the alimentary canal does include features within the mouth, such as the salivary glands. We talked about how the alimentary canal, a synonym for it is the GI tract. So this image is not displaying any accessory organs. I want somebody to tell me, and you can just name one or you can name as many as you'd like. What's an example of an accessory organ of the digestive system, right? What's not part of the GI tract? Pancreas, absolutely. What else? Let's think of one more before we move on. Think about an organ that's prevalent. Gallbladder, absolutely. I'm also thinking of liver. Yep. All right, awesome. So those are some examples of accessory organs. I would recommend reviewing the lecture slides because I think it goes into detail talking about how like the tongue and the teeth are considered accessory. And I think that can get a little confusing because, you know, we know that the mouth and the salivary glands are part of the tract. So I would recommend double checking the lecture slides and kind of reviewing the details between how to identify the two. But overview, alimentary canal, GI tract, accessory organs such as the pancreas, gallbladder, liver, they're part of the digestive system, just not part of the tract. So this is the pathway of food through the digestive system, right? The pathway of food through the GI tract. And so basically, this is very similar to what we've been doing. And so I'm keeping an eye on the time. I will stay on after. We have about, I think, 2 more slides after this. So if you guys want to stay on, I am more than willing to do that. But of course, I want to respect everyone's time. So if you have to leave, absolutely no worries. Please fill out the survey so that I can send you a PDF version of this PowerPoint. And it's going to have all the answer keys, and I'll add some explanations as well. All right, awesome. Thank you guys so much. So for this one, let's think about the anatomy of the digestive system. So when we look at this firsthand, right, we're like, okay, I'm asking you to label the organs of the GI tract. And so the reason I put pathway of food is that after you label these organs correctly, when you think about it conceptually of the pathway of food, food is going to hit each one of these organs in that specific order. So once you can correctly identify these organs, the pathway of food is actually going to be quite simple. And that's actually kind of a common theme that we've been talking about this workshop in, pathway of blood through the heart, right? We label the anatomy of the heart and we just go down, the list and understand the order. Respiratory system, right? We labeled the components of the respiratory system and the upper and lower respiratory tract. And then we think about it conceptually like, oh, okay, air is gonna, hit this structure, then this structure, then this structure. So that's kind of like my theme of this workshop is pathways. So similar to what we've been doing all workshop, I want you to match the number to the letter. And a trick here is that you can see that some letters are associated with the same number. So some numbers have 2 letters associated with them. All right, so I see a comment in the chat that's absolutely correct, but I also want you to think about like I said, there's some numbers that have 2 letters associated with them. All right, thank you guys for the comments in chat. I'm gonna go ahead and reveal the answers so that we can kind of make up some time here, and I will explain. So number 1 is indeed the esophagus. Number 2, we have the stomach. And then number 3, this is one where there's 2 letters associated. So number 3 is the small intestine, which actually everyone in the chat has answered that correctly, small intestine. Why is D also number 3? Can somebody tell me what does D mean? Like the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum, what are these in terms of what number 3 is representing? So I see in the comment parts of the small intestine, absolutely. So the small intestine is, this group of intestines. I don't know how else to explain it, but we section them off, right? So the first part is the okay, some people say duodenum, some people say duodenum. I don't know the correct pronunciation. I say duodenum. So we have the duodenum, the jejunum, which is the middle portion, and then the ileum. And then the ileum is going to connect to our large intestine. And an important fact to note is that the large intestine and the colon are synonyms. They mean the exact same thing. So you can use those words interchangeably and they will mean the same thing. So that's why number 4 was kind of like a trick question too. And then number 5 is representing the rectum and the anus. So when we think about the pathway of food, right? If we ingest food, we're going to chew it in our mouth, we're going to swallow it, it's going to go down our esophagus. Then it's going to hit our stomach. Then it's going to hit our small intestine. And if we want to be really specific and identify, okay, first it's going to hit the duodenum, then the jejunum, then the ileum. Then it's going to enter our colon, aka the large intestine. And then when, you'll get more into this when you, for those of you that are going to take Bio 66 physiology, like how the digestive system works and functions. But basically, kind of an overview: intake of food, digestion of food. We see that in the stomach and in the small intestine, absorption of nutrients, and then the colon specifically is responsible for the creation of waste. And then the defecation of that waste we see coming from the rectum and anus. So that is the overview of pathway of food through the GI tract. Any questions on that before we do our last slide on the wrap-up questions? Any questions on pathway of food? All right. So for our last slide, so the slide previously that I just did is just basically identifying the anatomical structures. I didn't really go into the functions behind it. That's what these review questions are aimed to do. So I recommend we will go over these review questions, but for the sake of time and the fact that I don't have PowerPoint slides on the physiology behind the GI system, I will refer you to your lecture slides, lecture notes, textbook, etc. So I've got 5 questions here. These are all true and false questions. And so I'm going to give you guys a minute to tell me, and you can just write like T and F to save time. 1 through 5. After reading the statement, do you think the statement is true or false? Feel free to unmute or put in the chat. 1 through 5. Is it true or is it false? I'll give you guys an extra minute and then I'll reveal the answers for the sake of time. And so I will make sure, because I don't know if we'll have a ton of time to kind of go over and explain, I will add onto the slides the explanations. And which reminds me, actually, I'm going to have to stop sharing real quick. I'm going to repost the links in the chat. Let me do that real quick so that you guys have them. Oops. Here is the link to the survey. And if you fill out the survey, you will get a PDF of these slides, and I will add the explanations. And then, of course, our YouTube channel, which has the, which will have the recording. So I see in the chat some answers. So let me actually, oh, I'm going to need a screen share again. All right. Hopefully you can all see my PowerPoint. So these were kind of trick questions in the fact that actually the answers are that these are all false. And I wanted to make these questions extra challenging so that you could really think about like the details of the digestive system. So I'm thinking for the sake of time, let's see. Well, that was my last slide. So I will explain. I'm going to add the explanations to the slides, and those will explain why these are all false. So for the sake of time, we'll move on. I will stay back on for anybody that has specific questions, and if you want to review that slide specifically, I'm more than happy to do that. So just as a conclusion, thank you guys so much for attending this workshop. I hope it was helpful. I'm sorry we ran out of time, but I am glad that we were able to really dive into the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system, as I know that those can be pretty challenging concepts. Just a reminder of our tutoring services. I am not the only Bio65 tutor. There's also Armand, and here is a flyer of both our hours. You can also find these flyers on your Canvas page, and it will give you detailed instructions on how to make an appointment with either myself or Armand for Bio65. Tutoring will end the week of December 3rd, and we are not tutoring over Thanksgiving break, but other than that, please feel free to make an appointment. I wish you all the best of luck on your upcoming exams. And again, I will stay on for a few minutes to anybody that has any questions. I will go back to this slide since that's what we were talking about, in case anyone has questions about this specifically. And again, I will please fill out the survey so that you can get the PDF slides. And also, I will add explanations throughout the slides of where I see fit so that you guys can have as much information. Thank you all. Have a great night.